bring to you a real challenge. I've come to deeply believe that character education is critical for kids, and yet kind of come up against this issue of how to make it inclusive of multiple cultural and racial perspectives.
Right.
I think of just two comments that kind of left me speechless. One coming out of being in a KIPP school for quite some time and observing over a number of days with my colleagues of color. And they just simply said, oh, they're teaching these kids how to blend in with rich white folks. And I was like, okay. And then I bring to you a second moment in a KIPP school as well, where an African-American boy was not allowed to wear the KIPP t-shirt because his character had not been worthy of what KIPP character is supposed to represent, and so he had to wear a different outfit. And so I just sat with him for a while and tried to understand it. And he's like, it's just really hard for me because when I'm loud or too loud, or if I ever interrupt, or if I act like myself or my mom, I have bad character. So how do you teach character without kind of developing self-loathing or loathing of identity or family at home?
Can I take a shot at
Paul,
that?
if you could take that on, because you're
So,
familiar
and again,
as well with the KIPP
in
experience.
Dave Levin's absence, I'll do my best to represent what he said to me about what's going on at KIPP. I think in some ways what I think you might have been seeing at KIPP is a change in culture that's going on there. So before the character report card came along, there was this idea that still exists in KIPP schools of slant. And certain ways of sitting, tracking the teacher with your eyes, paying attention. And what Dave Levin and Mike Feinberg, when they started KIPP, believed was that a lot of the kids they were teaching needed help with some of these arguably cultural ideas about how to pay attention, how to behave in school. It's connected with the idea of code switching, which I think is something that a lot of KIPP teachers believe, and something I think a lot of people believe, that when you're growing up in a non-dominant culture, if you want to fit in the dominant culture, you need to learn how to fake it at the very least, if not actually take on those traits. But I think that in lots of ways, the character report card is trying to supplant those ideas. That those ideas, I think, often do seem very culturally defined. In some ways, they are culturally defined. In some ways, they are about fitting in with a different culture. And it is very hard on kids very often. I think those things can be taught in a sensitive and intelligent way, but I know there's lots of painful moments in all of those schools as a result. And I think by trying to focus on these less culturally determined ideas like social intelligence, like self-control. I think that what Marty Seligman and Chris Peterson in the book that affected Dominic and Dave wrote was that these are not at all cultural. These are the character strengths that work in every culture at every era of history. And so in teaching you students to get better at these, this is something that has nothing to do with our culture and your culture. It's a trial and error process, and it doesn't always work, and it still, I think, leads to painful conversations. But I think that what they're trying to do is get better at that. I think they're trying to get better at finding ways to help kids learn these skills, learn these ways of fitting into cultures that they're not familiar with, without it being an attack on them.
I think there's just 2 points I'd just like to make. One, I think this is actually validates some kids' experience who've had really, really difficult lives and have learned some of these skills on their own, really very much on their own, and that isn't validated by SAT scores. And I think we need to balance out the idea that the SAT, I'm not sure, I think the SATs is important, but I think these type of skills and capacities are also important and need to be validated. I've worked with kids who've had incredibly low testing and yet have turned out to be incredibly brilliant students who've gone on and been incredibly successful. So, I think we've got to validate that type of course through our systems. The other thing is I think character, and I think KIPP is having dialogue around this, character can also be a sense of compliance. And I don't think, we want to bring up our generation thinking that you have to be compliant. That's actually, I don't think that's very good at all. And I think some of these things, the idea of showing curiosity, the idea of sort of saying, okay, you can be zesty and you may not be compliant at that point, is a way of pushing back on the idea of character as compliance or sort of behavior.